Early in the morning at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, travelers bustled past one another, creating a tense and hurried atmosphere. In the first-class waiting area, Rebecca Sullivan, a successful businesswoman, was glued to her phone, her eyes scanning rapidly through work emails. Today, she had an important flight to Atlanta, where she would be attending a high-stakes strategic conference. Rebecca was no stranger to the fast-paced corporate world. To her, success was the result of relentless effort, and she took great pride in the fact that she had achieved everything through her own hard work. She believed in herself, in her abilities, in her meticulously crafted plans. But there was one thing she had never truly reflected on: the concept of unconditional love that Jesus Christ taught. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Rebecca grabbed her small carry-on suitcase and made her way down the jet bridge to first class. She exhaled in relief upon finding her seat, a spacious, luxurious spot where she could finally unwind before her critical meeting. But just as she placed her designer handbag down, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a neatly pressed military uniform appeared beside her seat. His name tag read Nathan Carter. He paused briefly, checking his seat number, then gave a polite nod upon realizing that his assigned seat was right next to hers. Immediately, an unwelcome wave of irritation rose within her. Did he actually pay for a first-class ticket, or was this just one of those military perks? Rebecca gave him a brief glance before swiftly turning toward the window, making it clear that she had no interest in small talk. She wasn't the type to outwardly express her prejudices, but deep down, she believed that people like her were the ones who truly deserved these privileges. As the plane ascended smoothly into the sky, leveling off at cruising altitude, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, their crisp uniforms and practiced smiles creating an air of professional hospitality. One of them stopped beside Nathan, her expression warm and respectful. "Hello, sir. Thank you for your service to our country. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Her voice carried the same reverence Rebecca had heard 1,000 times before in movies, at airports, at public events, always reserved for men in uniform. Nathan gave a polite nod, offering a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it." Rebecca felt her brows pinch together instinctively. Another thank you, another special privilege. She said nothing, but the thought lingered, an irritation creeping up inside her. She wasn't the type to make a scene, but she had always believed in meritocracy, people earning their way through hard work, not special treatment. The flight attendant moved on, leaving Nathan adjusting his seatbelt, seemingly unaffected by the exchange. But Rebecca, unable to shake her frustration, found her mouth moving before she could stop herself. Her tone was cool, edged with sarcasm. "Must be nice, getting special treatment just for wearing a uniform. Huh?" Nathan turned to her, his face impassive. For a second, he didn't reply, as if measuring his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, completely devoid of the irritation she had expected. "I don't expect special treatment," he said simply. "I just do what I believe is right." Rebecca was momentarily caught off guard. She had expected a defensive remark, maybe even an argument. Instead, he had brushed aside her provocation with effortless composure. Something about his tone unsettled her. That quiet confidence, that absolute certainty, it made her feel wrong. But she wasn't ready to admit that, not even to herself. So, instead, she turned away, putting in her headphones and pretending to scroll through her phone. The classic exit strategy. Yet, despite her best efforts to shut him out, she found herself stealing a glance at him. Nathan sat there, relaxed but composed, his face betraying no signs of frustration. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out something small, a photograph. Rebecca caught sight of it out of the corner of her eye. The moment his fingers touched the picture, something in his demeanor shifted. His shoulders, which had held firm and upright, seemed to relax. The tension in his brow smoothed out. His expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. She tried to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at her. Her eyes flickered toward the photo, and before she could stop herself, the words came out. "Who's that?" Nathan didn't immediately look at her, his eyes still locked on the image. When he finally did turn, there was something gentle in his gaze. "My daughter," he said. "Her name's Abigail." Rebecca had not expected that. Her gaze shifted fully to the photograph now. It showed a young girl, around 9 years old, with a bright, bouncy head of curls and a toothy smile that radiated pure joy. She was holding a soccer ball, her tiny hands gripping it as if she had just finished a game and was beaming with pride. She hesitated before speaking again, this time her voice lacking its previous edge. "You're going to see her?" Nathan nodded. "Yeah, she's in Atlanta." Rebecca crossed her arms, leaning back in her seat, but her expression had changed. There was still skepticism, but now, a small trace of curiosity too. "She must be proud," she said, her voice cooling once more, slipping back into familiar sarcasm. "A father who always gets free benefits like you." The moment the words left her mouth, she saw something flicker across his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something much deeper, something raw. For the first time, a trace of pain cracked through his otherwise composed expression. But he didn't react the way she had expected. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply took a slow breath, then carefully tucked the photo away, as if shielding it from the weight of her words. Then, with that same unwavering steadiness, he said, "I paid for this seat, and I'm not looking for anyone's pity. I'm just a father trying to get to his daughter when she needs me most." Rebecca stared at him, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. A part of her wanted to fire back, to hold on to her irritation, her sense of justification. But something about the way he had said it, the way his voice had remained so even, so firm yet calm, made her question herself in a way she wasn't used to. She turned toward the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly before them, vast and open, offering no answers. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar pressing at the edges of her certainty, something that made her uncomfortable, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The next morning, as the golden light of dawn spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her luxury hotel suite in Atlanta, Rebecca Sullivan sat in a sleek, modern chair, coffee untouched beside her, her phone in hand. It was supposed to be a quick scan, just a routine check of the financial markets before she headed downstairs to the conference hall. A habit, a ritual, a way to stay ahead. Her finger moved swiftly across the screen, scrolling past business headlines, stock fluctuations, mergers, quarterly earnings reports, everything that normally commanded her full attention. But today, none of it registered, because her eyes suddenly froze on a headline she hadn't been expecting. Desperate Army father seeks help to save his daughter with a failing heart. Her breath hitched. An uneasy sensation spread through her chest, something she couldn't quite explain. Without thinking, she tapped the article. The page took only a second to load, but that single second felt unbearably long. And then, the first image appeared. A hospital bed, a little girl, no more than 9 years old, her tiny body nearly swallowed by the maze of 4 tubes, beeping monitors, and sterile white sheets. Her face was pale, too pale, and her small hands rested motionless beside her. Even in a still photograph, Rebecca could feel the weight of the moment, the fragility, the desperation. Her stomach twisted. She scrolled down, and that's when she saw him. Nathan Carter, the man she had mocked, dismissed, misjudged. He was sitting beside the bed, gripping the little girl's hand as if he could somehow anchor her to this world through sheer will alone. His head was bowed, but his expression was unmistakable, a mixture of exhaustion, agony, and fierce, unwavering love. The same man who had sat beside her on the plane just hours ago, enduring her cold remarks without retaliation. A sharp pang shot through her chest. She hadn't known. She hadn't even cared to ask. Rebecca inhaled shakily, forcing herself to keep reading. Abigail Carter was born with a severe congenital heart defect and needed urgent, high-risk surgery. Military insurance wouldn't cover the full cost of the procedure. Nathan had launched a fundraiser, pleading for help to save his daughter's life. He had rushed to Atlanta because her condition had taken a sudden, devastating turn for the worse. Rebecca could barely breathe. Her own words from the plane came crashing back at her, slicing through her conscience like a blade. She must be proud. A father who always gets free benefits like you. The memory of her voice, so flippant, so dismissive, now felt like poison in her veins. She gripped the phone tighter, her whole body going cold. How could she have been so blind? The man she had belittled, mocked for supposed privileges, was in the fight of his life, trying to save his child, and she had treated him like an inconvenience. Rebecca's gaze locked onto Abigail's photo again. That bright-eyed, curly-haired girl from Nathan's wallet, the one she had barely given a second thought to on the plane, was lying in that hospital bed, fighting for every breath. The room around her felt smaller, heavier, suffocating. For the first time in her life, Rebecca was forced to confront something she had always avoided. She had been wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong, and no amount of success, confidence, or well-crafted arguments could undo it. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred, and before she even realized what she was doing, her fingers were moving, tapping, searching, desperate to do something. Because suddenly, there was only one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't just walk away from this. A crushing wave of guilt settled deep in Rebecca's chest, making it impossible to breathe. She had faced difficult moments before, stressful business meetings, make-or-break deals, high-pressure presentations, but nothing had ever made her feel like this, like she had failed as a human being. She didn't hesitate. Her hands moved on instinct, pulling up Nathan's fundraising page. She quickly scanned the total, $150,000 needed, but so far, only 1/3 had been raised. Her heart pounded. She barely thought before typing in the amount, $10,000. Her finger hovered over the confirmation button. A second of hesitation, and then she pressed it. A small notification popped up, donation successful. She stared at it, waiting for relief. It never came. The guilt still pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. And in that moment, a realization hit her like a thunderbolt. Money couldn't erase what she had done. She had spent her entire life believing money solved problems, that throwing cash at an issue was enough to make it go away. But this was different. She could give all the money in the world, but it wouldn't change the fact that she had judged a man without knowing his story, that she had mocked a father who was fighting for his little girl's life. A lump formed in her throat. She sat frozen, staring at the screen, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Even after donating, she still felt empty inside, because deep down, she knew she had to do more. Her pulse hammered as she grabbed her coat, threw it over her shoulders, and rushed out of the hotel. The streets of Atlanta were busy, the city pulsing with morning commuters. But Rebecca barely noticed. She hailed a cab with a sharp wave. "Take me to Peachtree Medical Center," she said quickly, sliding into the back seat. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror but nodded, merging into traffic. As the car wove through the streets, her mind raced. How was she supposed to face Nathan? Would he even let her in? Would he tell her to leave? And more importantly, did she deserve anything else? Her fingers clenched the edge of her coat as doubt gnawed at her. But it was too late to turn back now. 15 minutes later, the cab pulled up to the hospital entrance. Rebecca stepped out, her stomach twisting into knots. The automatic doors slid open, and the sterile scent of antiseptics and hospital-grade disinfectant filled her nose. The hallway lights were harsh, almost unforgiving, and the steady beeping of machines echoed faintly in the distance. She swallowed hard. This was it. She followed the signs toward the pediatric intensive care unit, her heels clicking against the cold tile floor, each step heavier than the last. And then, finally, she was there, standing outside Abigail Carter's hospital room. A part of her wanted to run, turn around, leave before she made a bigger mistake. But then she saw Nathan. He was sitting beside the hospital bed, his broad shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The same man who had held himself so firmly on that plane now looked completely drained. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights, and yet his hand never left his daughter's. Rebecca's chest tightened. She had never seen pain like this before. Not the kind money could fix. Not the kind that an apology could erase. She swallowed, forcing herself to move forward, then gently knocked on the doorframe. Nathan's head lifted instantly. His expression changed, a flicker of surprise, then guarded hesitation. His voice was quiet, cautious. "Miss Sullivan?" Rebecca's throat felt tight. For the first time in her life, she felt truly ashamed. Not because she had lost a business deal, not because she had made a bad investment, but because she had been so incredibly, painfully wrong about someone. She cleared her throat, but her voice still trembled when she spoke. I saw the news about your daughter," she managed, her words barely above a whisper. Nathan said nothing. His eyes, tired, guarded, questioning, studied her closely. She swallowed hard. She hesitated, then exhaled sharply, gathering what little courage she had left. "I'm so sorry for what I said yesterday." The words felt both too small and yet enormous at the same time. Nathan didn't reply immediately, and for a moment, she feared the worst. Feared he would tell her to leave, that she had no right to be here. And honestly, she wouldn't blame him if he did. But instead, after a long pause, he let out a quiet sigh. His shoulders, which had been tense moments ago, eased just slightly. "You don't have to apologize," he finally said, his tone calm but firm. Rebecca blinked. "What?" He held her gaze for a moment before continuing, his voice lower. "I've met plenty of people who think like you." That sentence, it stung in a way she hadn't expected, because he was right. She had been one of those people. She felt a pang of shame tighten in her chest. "But," he added after a beat, "I just didn't expect you to be here." Rebecca exhaled shakily. She knew one apology wasn't enough. She knew she couldn't erase the damage she had done with just a few words. But she had to start somewhere. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "I need to do more than that." Rebecca had always believed money solved problems. It was how she had climbed the corporate ladder, how she had built her success, how she had controlled every aspect of her life. But this time, she realized, money alone wasn't enough. Her $10,000 donation might help cover some hospital costs, but it wouldn't ease Nathan's sleepless nights. It wouldn't remove the fear clenching his heart every time his daughter struggled to breathe. It wouldn't give Abigail the best possible chance at survival, and that thought haunted her. So, she did something she had never done before. She made herself personally invested. She picked up the phone and called every connection she had: CEOs, executives, hospital board members, anyone who owed her a favor or had influence in the medical world. She leveraged every ounce of power, every professional relationship she had built over the years, and it worked. Abigail's case was reviewed immediately, within hours. A specialist, one of the country's leading pediatric heart surgeons, was assigned to her case. The surgery, which had been scheduled for weeks later, was now moved up to the next morning. Nathan was stunned. He had spent weeks fighting with insurance companies, filing appeals, hoping for a miracle. And now, in less than a day, things had changed. Because of Rebecca, because the same woman who had once dismissed him on a plane had now used her power, her influence, her privilege, to fight for his daughter like she was her own. The night before the surgery, Rebecca sat in the hospital waiting room. She had told herself she would just make the calls and then go back to her hotel. But she couldn't leave. She couldn't just walk away. Nathan sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, his fingers interlaced in silent prayer. He had barely spoken in the last hour, his eyes fixed on the floor. But Rebecca could sense the war raging inside him. He was a soldier, a man who had faced battlefields, deployments, life or death situations. But this was a different kind of battle, one where he had no control, one where his little girl's life was in someone else's hands. Rebecca had no words of comfort. She wasn't used to this kind of helpless waiting, where no amount of planning or preparation could guarantee an outcome. All she could do was sit there and wait with him. The next morning, as Abigail was wheeled into surgery, Nathan bent down, brushing his fingers over her curls, whispering words of reassurance. Even as his voice remained steady, Rebecca could see the fear behind his eyes. She had never seen a love like this before, the kind of love that held on even when everything felt like it was slipping away, the kind of love that would have traded places in a heartbeat. The moment the operating room doors swung shut, Rebecca felt an ache deep in her chest, and for the first time, she understood something she never had before. Nathan wasn't just a soldier, he was a father, and he wasn't fighting for a country today. He was fighting for his little girl. Hours passed, long agonizing hours filled with nothing but waiting. The seconds dragged on, stretching into something unbearable. Nathan never moved from his seat. He barely even blinked. Rebecca, for the first time in her life, prayed, not because she had to, not because it was the right thing to do, but because she wanted to. Because she couldn't shake the image of Abigail's small hands clutching her father's, her innocent eyes looking up at him with unwavering trust. Because she had seen the way Nathan had whispered to her, promising he would be there when she woke up. Because she had never wanted anything in her life to be okay more than she did in that moment. Then, finally, the doors opened. The surgeon stepped out, pulling off his mask. And with just one look at his expression, Rebecca felt the weight of the entire world lift. The surgery was a success. Nathan's body visibly sagged, as if he had been holding himself upright by sheer force of will alone. His hands pressed against his face. And then, he broke. Right there in the hospital hallway, the strong, unshakable soldier let out a shuddering breath and dropped his head into his hands. Relief. Overwhelming, breathtaking relief. Rebecca swallowed hard, her own eyes stinging with tears she hadn't expected. And in that moment, she realized this was the first time she had ever witnessed true, selfless love. Not the kind she had read about in books, not the kind that came with conditions or expectations, but a love so deep that it didn't care about pride, didn't care about appearances, didn't care about anything but the life of someone else, and it changed her forever. A few days later, as Abigail slowly regained her strength, Rebecca visited her hospital room. Nathan was sitting beside her bed, reading softly from a children's book, his deep voice calm and soothing. Abigail's tiny fingers curled around his, her breathing still weak but steady. And then, her wide, curious eyes flickered toward Rebecca. She studied her for a moment, then reached out a small, fragile hand. "You're my dad's friend, right?" Rebecca felt her breath catch. For so long, she had defined herself by titles, by wealth, by accomplishments. But in that moment, all of that faded into the background. She wasn't a CEO. She wasn't a businesswoman. She wasn't even the woman who had once looked down on the soldier sitting beside her. She was just Rebecca, someone who had finally learned what truly mattered. She reached out, taking Abigail's hand as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad's friend." And for the first time in her life, she felt a joy that didn't come from success, wealth, or recognition, but from helping someone who truly needed her. In the days following Abigail's surgery, Rebecca found herself lingering at the hospital more than she had planned. She had never been one to stay in one place for too long. Her life had always been about moving forward, chasing success, staying ahead of the curve. But now, she didn't want to leave. She wasn't checking emails or refreshing stock reports. She wasn't rushing off to meetings or thinking about profit margins. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was fully present, and it felt right. She spent her days sitting beside Abigail's hospital bed, reading stories to her in a soft, warm voice, something she never imagined herself doing. She brought the little girl her favorite snacks, fluffed her pillows, held her tiny hand when she stirred in her sleep, and she stayed for Nathan, too. She watched as the once composed, battle-hardened soldier allowed himself to breathe again, to smile, to hope. She listened when he talked about his late wife, about how he had raised Abigail alone, about the struggles of balancing military life with fatherhood. She held his hand when his voice faltered, when the exhaustion from months of fear and uncertainty threatened to overtake him. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but at some point, helping them had stopped feeling like an obligation and had become something deeper, something sacred. And for the first time in her life, Rebecca understood what it meant to love selflessly. One late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun spilled into the hospital room, casting a soft glow on the white walls. Rebecca sat quietly, watching as Nathan leaned over his daughter's bed, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing Abigail's curls away from her forehead. Then, with a deep breath, he bowed his head in prayer. Rebecca had never been a religious person. She had always viewed faith as something distant, something other people leaned on when they needed comfort. She had never felt the need for it herself, but as she watched Nathan, a man who had faced war, seen the worst of humanity, endured pain most people couldn't imagine, bow his head in quiet surrender to God, she felt something stir inside her, something deeper than guilt. This wasn't about righting a wrong anymore. This wasn't about making amends for her past behavior. This was about transformation. Something inside her was shifting, something she couldn't quite name yet, but could feel with every fiber of her being. That night, when she returned to her hotel room, she did something she never thought she would. She picked up the Bible from the nightstand. She hesitated at first, her fingers running along the edges of the worn cover. It felt foreign in her hands, unfamiliar. But then, she opened it, and as she started reading, something inside her clicked into place. She had read words before, but never like this, never with a heart hungry for understanding. She had spent her entire life chasing after things that never truly satisfied her. success, wealth, validation. But these words filled something inside her she hadn't even realized was empty. A few days later, she found herself inside a church. She hadn't planned on going, but as she walked past a small chapel near the hospital, something made her stop. She wasn't sure what it was, a force, a whisper, a gentle pull on her soul. But before she knew it, she was inside, sitting in one of the pews, staring at the open Bible in her lap. And then, her eyes landed on a verse. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. James 1 verse 19. Her breath caught, her pulse stilled. That verse, it felt like it had been written just for her. It was as if God had been waiting for her to find it, to hear it, to finally understand what he had been trying to teach her all along. She sat there for a long time, her fingers brushing over the ink, letting the words sink into the deepest parts of her soul. Because that verse was her. She had spent her whole life quick to judge, slow to listen, quick to speak without thinking. She had allowed pride and entitlement to shape her view of the world, to cloud her ability to truly see people for who they were. But God had softened her heart. God had taken the woman she was on that plane, arrogant, dismissive, full of prejudice, and turned her into someone capable of love, of kindness, of humility. A tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time, she whispered a prayer. Not because she felt obligated, not because she thought it was the right thing to do, but because she wanted to. Not long after Abigail was discharged, Nathan invited Rebecca to his home for a small gathering. It wasn't anything extravagant, just family, close friends, a quiet celebration after months of uncertainty and fear. And yet, as she sat in his backyard, listening to the sound of laughter, of joy, of life, she felt more at home than she ever had before. At some point during the evening, Abigail ran up to her, her curls bouncing as she threw her arms around Rebecca's waist. Her small voice was filled with excitement, her eyes sparkling like morning sunshine. Miss Bika, you'll always be my friend, right? Rebecca's throat tightened. She had spent so much of her life avoiding attachments, avoiding anything that made her feel vulnerable. But looking at this little girl, this little warrior who had fought so hard to stay alive, Rebecca knew, without a doubt, that she had been changed forever. She bent down, wrapping her arms around Abigail's tiny frame, holding her close. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I will always be here. And as she lifted her gaze toward the night sky, where countless stars shimmered like tiny, eternal reminders of grace, she knew one thing for certain. God had given her a second chance to love, a second chance to change, a second chance to truly live. And in that moment, as the cool night breeze whispered around her, she realized she had found something more valuable than success, more fulfilling than wealth, more lasting than recognition. She had found a heart transformed by the love of Jesus Christ. Rebecca's story is not just a journey of personal change. It is a profound lesson on faith, compassion, and forgiveness. Prejudice can cloud the heart, but God's love has the power to break down every barrier. When Rebecca had the courage to look within herself, when she allowed God to transform her heart, she not only helped a family in need, but also discovered the true meaning of her own life. If today you are holding on to prejudice, anger, or the mistakes of your past, allow God to soften your heart. Ask yourself, is there someone in my life I need to love instead of judge? Am I willing to let God change me the way He changed Rebecca? Let the love of Jesus Christ transform you today.